Sometimes life doesn't collapse all at once. It erodes quietly, piece by piece, until you look around and realize there's nothing left to lose. At 47, Mason Trigg stood at the edge of a narrow forest clearing, staring at a rotting mountain cabin that felt like a cruel punchline to his life. 2 decades earlier, he had built a construction company with his own hands, waking before dawn, working past exhaustion, believing effort guaranteed stability. Then the economy turned, projects vanished, loans piled up, and pride kept him silent far too long. His house was taken. His tools were sold. His world shrank to a single duffel bag and an inheritance from an uncle he barely remembered. The cabin leaned under its own age, windows shattered, roof sagging, moss crawling through the seams like nature reclaiming a debt. Mason almost laughed. This was what remained of everything he'd been. He considered leaving, driving until the road disappeared and pretending this place never existed. But exhaustion anchored him. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and abandonment. Light filtered through broken glass, illuminating dust and decay. Then he saw it, a dark beam carved with names and dates stretching back decades. Messages etched deep into the wood. Made it through, found shelter. God bless this place. Mason traced the grooves with shaking fingers. Strangers had stood where he stood, broken in their own ways, desperate enough to leave proof they survived. In that moment, the cabin stopped feeling like a joke. It felt like a question, quietly asking whether he would walk away like everyone else had, or stay. The journey to the cabin had already felt like a slow stripping away of his old life. The paved road gave way to gravel, then dirt, then something barely worthy of being called a path. Mason's aging truck rattled and complained until it finally died, forcing him to walk the last stretch under towering trees that swallowed sound and signal alike. Each step reminded him of the years he'd spent building something solid, believing permanence came from hard work alone. He thought of his daughter, Iris, 19 now, calling him with careful concern, asking where he was staying like roles had reversed. She'd watched him crumble during the final months of bankruptcy, seen the man who once fixed everything stare helplessly at numbers he couldn't solve. Inside the cabin, Mason found a journal hidden behind loose stone in the fireplace. The handwriting was careful, dated decades earlier, describing travelers trapped by storms, families running low on food, men injured in logging accidents who crawled here because someone told them to. Over and over, one line appeared. Leave it better than you found it. This place had never belonged to one person. It belonged to need. Sitting on the cold hearth, Mason felt something shift inside him. Failure had hollowed him out for months, leaving only shame and regret. But reading those pages, he understood this cabin had never been about ownership or success. It existed because people once chose to care for something they might never benefit from again. For the first time since losing everything, Mason felt the faintest pull forward, not toward rebuilding his old life, but toward understanding what this one might still become. Mason's first days became a study in controlled survival. He cleared animal nests, swept out debris, and patched holes in the roof with salvaged boards, working until his hands burned and his back protested. The labor felt honest in a way paperwork and negotiations never had. At night, he read more from the journal by firelight, learning how the cabin once served as a waypoint for people crossing dangerous terrain with nothing but hope and desperation. On the 8th day, while prying up rotten floorboards near the fireplace, his crowbar struck something solid. Beneath the dirt was a flat stone deliberately placed, not natural. He lifted it and uncovered a cavity lined with oilcloth. Inside lay a carefully folded blueprint dated 1952. It showed plans to expand the cabin into a proper shelter, bunks, storage, reinforced walls. Tucked beside it were letters written in trembling hands. A mother thanking whoever stocked firewood. A man describing how this place saved his family during a snowstorm. Mason read until his throat tightened. This wasn't coincidence. Someone had once dreamed of making this refuge permanent. That night, a violent storm rolled in. Rain found every weakness Mason hadn't sealed, dripping through the roof and walls. He spent hours hammering boards into place in freezing darkness, soaked to the bone, refusing to let the structure give in. Somewhere between thunderclaps, Mason understood he wasn't just fighting the weather. He was defending something fragile and rare, a promise passed down by strangers who believed that survival sometimes depended on places left open for those who had nowhere else to go. By dawn, the storm broke, leaving the forest steaming under pale light. The cabin still stood, battered but intact. Mason sat on the porch steps, exhausted, when his phone buzzed with Iris's name. Hearing her voice grounded him. He couldn't fully explain what he was doing, only that it mattered. Over the following weeks, he drove into a nearby town for supplies, where an older shopkeeper recognized the cabin's name immediately. Stories spilled out: grandparents saved during the Depression, loggers who survived winters because someone told them to head there. Back at the cabin, Mason found more hidden pieces. A hand-carved wooden train, military dog tags with a simple note reading "Made at home," and a wedding ring buried beneath the floorboards alongside a faded photograph of a couple smiling in front of the cabin decades earlier. Each discovery carried the same quiet truth: people came here broken and left whole enough to keep going. Mason began documenting everything, photographing names carved into the beam, recording letters, preserving objects that time had nearly erased. The work reshaped him. His body grew stronger, his thoughts steadier. He wasn't measuring progress in money or milestones anymore. He measured it in continuity, in respect for lives he'd never meet, in the knowledge that something worthwhile existed simply because people once refused to abandon it. For the first time since losing everything, Mason felt like he wasn't just surviving. He was contributing to something larger than himself. Winter arrived without ceremony, burying the forest in silence and snow. Mason insulated the walls, installed simple bunks, and rigged a crude water system, turning the cabin into a functional shelter once more. Visitors began appearing: hikers, elders searching for stories their parents told, descendants tracing family names carved into the beam. Iris visited during break, bringing friends who studied conservation and architecture. Together they worked, laughed, and shared meals beside the fire. Mason taught again, showing how to assess structural integrity, how to respect old craftsmanship instead of replacing it blindly. Then the warning arrived. A county official stepped onto the porch with paperwork detailing 17 years of unpaid taxes. The cabin was scheduled for auction. Everything Mason had restored, every story preserved, faced erasure in 6 weeks. The number felt impossible. That night, searching through old documents, Mason found the original deed from the late 19th century. It declared the land a perpetual commons, never intended for private profit, dedicated forever to sheltering travelers in need. With help from a preservation lawyer, Mason brought the story into the open. Articles were written, testimonials collected. People came forward with proof that the cabin still served its purpose. What began as a legal fight became a moral one. Mason realized this place didn't belong to him. It belonged to everyone who had ever needed it, and everyone who might need it again. Support arrived from unexpected corners. Donations trickled in, then surged. Small businesses contributed. Descendants shared family histories tied to the cabin. Iris helped launch a campaign that told the truth plainly: this place had saved lives, and it still could. As the deadline approached, Mason worked during the day and answered messages late into the night, documenting artifacts and recording stories. The cabin filled again, not just with people, but with purpose. Iris watched her father closely, seeing something she hadn't seen in years. He wasn't chasing success anymore. He was standing for something. Standing in the doorway one quiet evening, Mason ran his hand along the carved beam, reading names etched by people who survived long enough to leave proof behind. He didn't add his own. He understood now that guardianship wasn't about recognition. It was about continuity. The cabin had changed him in ways no business ever had. It had given him back his patience, his connection to his daughter, and his belief that effort mattered even when outcomes were uncertain. Whether the auction was stopped or not, Mason knew the cabin had already done its work on him. It had stripped away the illusion that value comes from ownership and replaced it with something steadier: the knowledge that protecting something meaningful can rebuild a person from the inside out. As the final days approached, the pressure intensified, but so did the resolve around him. People traveled long distances just to stand inside the cabin and touch the beam, reading names whispered through generations. Mason realized the cabin had become more than wood and stone. It was memory made physical. Each artifact told a story of survival, reminding visitors that hardship wasn't new and neither was kindness. Iris and her friends helped organize records, photographing everything, ensuring nothing would vanish even if the worst happened. Mason watched his daughter move through the space with quiet reverence, and it struck him how different this moment felt from the months she'd watched him lose everything. This time she wasn't witnessing collapse. She was witnessing resistance. The cabin had taught him something no balance sheet ever could. Success measured only by profit is fragile, but success measured by service endures. On the final night before the deadline, Mason sat alone by the fire, listening to the cabin creak and settle, the way it had for over a century. He felt fear, yes, but also peace. No matter the outcome, he had chosen to stand rather than disappear. He had honored the people who came before him and set an example for the one person who mattered most. Sometimes the truest inheritance isn't money or property. It's the courage to protect what cannot protect itself. In the end, Mason understood that life had taken everything that could be taken from him to reveal what could never be lost. The cabin